past decade involved with certification and testing. As Sarah mentioned, if you have questions at the end, please feel free to send them in, and we'll try to accommodate as many questions as possible. Okay, so the agenda for today is the Radio Equipment Directive, and we're going to be talking a little bit about the R&TTE Directive, which is the outgoing directive, which we call the old directive. And then we're going to do an introduction to the Radio Equipment Directive, which is the new directive. And throughout the presentations, you'll hear me refer to the Radio Equipment Directive, the RED, or the RED, and just keep in mind it means the same thing. We're going to talk a little bit about the scope of the Radio Equipment Directive, what's new in this directive. We're going to talk a little bit about manufacturer responsibilities and labeling of the equipment, which is also important, and also some conformity assessment procedures. So the status quo, the Radio and the Telecommunications Terminal Equipment Directive, is what's currently in force. And anytime you have a radio device that needs to go into Europe, you need to make sure you meet the R&TTE Directive. There were some shortcomings under this directive. Some of the shortcomings were roles and responsibilities were not clear, and not much emphasis was given on traceability and market surveillance. There have been issues where during market surveillance, products were not in compliance. They didn't have the right labeling. No user manuals were found in the appropriate language. And so to address all those shortcomings, they updated the directive. So the new Radio Equipment Directive, also known as the RED, will replace the R&TTE Directive. It's been a work in progress since about 2007, and it was a consequence of aligning the R&TTE Directive with the requirements of the new legislative framework. Okay, so under the new Radio Equipment Directive, devices operating below 3,000 gigahertz is included. Okay, so the objectives of the Radio Equipment Directive are to reinforce the obligations of the economic operators and to improve the legal tools available to member states in order to improve efficiency, in particular regarding traceability. Also, to clarify and simplify certain provisions, including the scope, in order to facilitate the application of the directive. To modify or suppress a number of administrative obligations which create burden but bring in only limited value added, and to also insert certain requirements aiming at facilitating the use of radio equipment. Possibility to issue delegated acts for interoperability. So we all have cell phones, we all have cell phone chargers, and every time we buy a new cell phone, we have to buy a charger. So wouldn't it be nice if we had one charger for all the phones out there? So to promote interoperability, the legal framework of the Radio Equipment Directive has been modified so that it can be introduced if needed by a member state. So the scope of the Radio Equipment Directive will include radio communication and also radio determination. So radio receivers, such as sound and TV broadcast receivers, are in the scope, whereas in the past they've been under the EMC. Directive. The safety of animals and property will be also in the scope. It's interesting to note that the safety of animals has always been there under the R&TTE Directive as well, but under the RED, it will be emphasized even more. And equipment operating below 9 kilohertz will now be under the Radio Equipment Directive, whereas in the past it was excluded from the R&TTE Directive. So one interesting point to note is the safety of animals. How would you necessarily make sure the safety of animals is applied? So when the Radio Equipment Directive comes into force, there could be very well standards that are written for the safety of animals. One thing that I can think of is maybe SAR standard. You could possibly apply SAR to determine if it's detrimental to animals. That is one standard that could be used possibly. So what's not in the new Radio Equipment Directive? So network terminal equipment such as fax machines are no longer under the Radio Equipment Directive. They will be transitioned into the EMC Directive. Parts destined for commercial or military airplanes will not be in the red. Custom-built evaluation kits destined for professionals to be used solely at research and developmental facilities for such purposes. So if you have any custom-built evaluation kits, those will no longer be in the scope of the Radio Equipment Directive, meaning no testing would be required as long as it meets the criteria of a custom-built kit. Equipment used by amateur radio operators will be outside of the scope, and ISM equipment not used for communication. So equipment like microwaves, induction, cooktop will be outside of the scope. So some definitions to keep in mind. Radio equipment is defined as an electrical or electronic product which intentionally emits and or receives radio waves for the purpose of radio communication and or radio determination, or an electrical or electronic product which must be completed with an accessory such as an antenna so as to intentionally emit and or receive radio waves for the purpose of radio communication and or radio determination. And also, if you recall, radio determination equipment is also under the scope. So radio determination means the determination of the position, velocity, and or other characteristics of an object, or the obtaining of information relating to those parameters by means of the propagation properties of radio waves. Another quick definition is economic operators, and economic operators means manufacturer, the authorized representative, the importer, and the distributor. So all those things are defined by economic operator. Some transition dates to keep in mind. The R&TTE Directive ceases to provide assumption of conformity after June 12, 2016. There's a 1-year transition period for existing products until June 12, 2017. If a new radio product is placed on the market between June 13, 2016 and June 12, 2017, it shall meet the new Radio Equipment Directive. So before June 13, 2016, the Radio Equipment Directive shall not be used, and therefore the declaration of conformity making reference to the Radio Equipment Directive shall not be used. So it's important, if you're a manufacturer, you should not issue your declaration of conformity to the RED until that date. Radio Equipment Directive notified body shall not issue notified body reports and EU type examination certificates with the RED reference. And importantly, R&TTE notified body issuing notified body opinions will have a statement stating that the opinion under the R&TTE Directive will expire on June 2017. And probably, if you've gotten a notified body opinion lately, you might have seen that statement where the opinion will cease to exist after that date because R&TTE will be repealed. So based on those transition dates, there are a couple of transition cases that I'm going to outline here that will probably apply to you if you're a manufacturer of a radio product. The first one is if you have radio equipment currently in the scope of the R&TTE Directive. So you have until June 13th, 2017 to use the current declaration of conformity under the R&TTE Directive. After that date, you will have to draw up a new declaration of conformity under the RED. So what do you need to do at that stage? First of all, you have to determine if you still meet the requirements of the standards that's applicable to you. And if you do, you just reissue your declaration of conformity under the Radio Equipment Directive. You might find out that your device is no longer in the scope of the R&TTE Directive or the Radio Equipment Directive, and it's been moved to the EMC Directive. And at that point, you'll have to realign your declaration of conformity to the appropriate directives. So the second transition case is if you have equipment moving out of the EMC Directive and low voltage directive and into the Radio Equipment Directive. So radio and TV broadcast receivers used to be in the EMC Directive, but they'll be moving into the Radio Equipment Directive. Transmitters and receivers that operate below 9 kilohertz, they'll be in the scope of the RED, and these devices can continue to be sold until June 13th, 2017, but after that, it needs to fall under the Radio Equipment Directive, and you will have to reissue your declaration of conformity to the new standards and to the new directive. So the last transition case is equipment moving out of the R&TTE Directive and into the EMC Directive or the low voltage directive. So examples like telephones, fax machines, wired routers, in-house PLC equipment, they will no longer be under the Radio Equipment Directive. They'll move into the EMC or the low voltage directive. Interesting to note that there are no transition periods to the EMC or the low voltage directive. So kind of a gray area on when you need to move out of the Radio Equipment Directive and into the other directives. Okay, so I get asked quite a lot, who is the responsible party for Europe? And it's always been defined in the Radio Equipment Directive, or clearly defined in the R&TTE Directive, that is the manufacturer. But under the Radio Equipment Directive, the new directive, it's well defined in that manufacturer having detailed knowledge of the design and production process to carry out the conformity assessment procedure. Conformity assessment should therefore remain solely the obligation of the manufacturer. So it's not the test house that did the testing for you. It's not the plant that produced your equipment. It's the manufacturer of the device, owner of the device that's responsible. So if you look at the Radio Equipment Directive, it's broken down into different chapters. Chapter 1 is basically the scope of the directive. Chapter 2 has obligations of economic operators, and we define economic operators. Chapter 3 deals with harmonized standards and conformity assessment procedures. Chapter 4 is solely for conformity assessment bodies. Chapter 5 surveillance. All right, sorry, we're having some little technical difficulties here. I hope everybody can hear us properly now. There was some feedback coming through. I hope we've been able to resolve it. Okay, so Chapter 5, we had market surveillance. Chapter 6, implementing and delegated acts. Chapter 7, transitional provisions. So under the Radio Equipment Directive, which is Article 3, which is the essential requirements, they're pretty much the same as the radio R&TTE Directive requirements, where Article 3.1 states that radio equipment shall be constructed so as to ensure A, the protection of health and the safety of persons and of domestic animals, and the protection of property, including the objectives with respect to safety requirements set out in the directive. But with no voltage limit applying. And B, an adequate level of electromagnetic compatibility set out in directive, in the EMC directive. Also getting some feedback that we still have a lot of crosstalk in the audio, so apologize for that. We're trying to resolve it as quickly as possible, but in the interest of time, I'll keep on talking and keeping in mind that this presentation will be available online after the presentation is over, and we'll entertain questions even when the webinar is over. Okay, Article 3.2 is the radio equipment shall be constructed that it both effectively uses and supports the efficient use of radio spectrum in order to avoid harmful interference. Article 3.3 is radio equipment within certain categories or passage shall be so constructed that it complies with the following essential requirements. A. Radio equipment interworks with accessories, in particular with common chargers. And that's the issue that I talked about before, where it'll be nice to have one charger that will work with a multitude of phones. Manufacturer obligations. Manufacturers should search the EFIS frequency information for band allocation in each member state before placing on the market. Prior notification is not required. So if you recall, under the R&TTE Directive, sometimes you would see the CE mark followed by a exclamation mark. And what that meant was that not all frequencies that the device can operate on may be operational in all of the European Union member states. So let's say, for instance, if you had a 2.4 Bluetooth device that went into Germany, as an example, those frequencies might not be available in France. So what manufacturers did was, after the CE mark, they would place an exclamation mark just to point out that this device may not operate in all member states. So that's been done away with, where it is now the manufacturer's obligation to make sure that the frequency that your device operates on is allowed in that member state. And the way to do that would be to go to this website where you can type in the country that you want to sell into, and it'll show you all the frequencies that that's available in that country. So, and again, the obligation is on the manufacturer, and you'll be held responsible. So to meet the essential requirements, you have to meet Article 3 of the Radio Equipment Directive. And Article 3 defines the health and safety aspect of it, as well as the efficient use of the radio spectrum. So 3.1a and 3.1b are basically the health and safety of persons. And the manufacturer may demonstrate compliance either by applying harmonized standards or by other means. So if there's a well-defined harmonized standard that is geared towards your product, you can use those harmonized standards. but that is not the only way of going about doing it. If you have a non-typical device where there's no harmonized standard that fits your product, you may choose to do your own testing, and you may have a notified body review the work that you've done. For 3.1a and 3.1b, there is no need to go through a notified body. So for 3.2, which is the radio efficient use of the radio spectrum, you can choose to have that reviewed by a notified body, but you can choose to exclude the 3.1a and 3.1b from the scope of the review. So as I mentioned before, 3.2, a notified body shall be used if harmonized standards are not used or partially applied. You can always use a notified body at your discretion, but there's no mandatory requirement if you use all harmonized standards. So additional manufacturer obligations, you must draw up a technical documentation to show compliance to the directive. A single DOC shall be drawn up by the manufacturer in a language appropriate for the member state. So if you have a product that goes into 2 different countries in the European Union, you must make sure that the DOC is customized so that it references in the language of the member state. A permanent CE mark placed on the device before entering the market. So the device must have a CE mark. E-labeling is allowed for devices that have a screen. So if your device is let's say a cell phone which has a screen, you may choose to use e-labeling. And the manufacturer shall keep the technical documentation and the declaration of conformity for 10 years after the radio equipment has been placed on the market. If the CE mark is placed, it shall be capable of operating in at least 1 member state, which is important. We should note that some manufacturers like to put the CE mark on a product that, for example, goes to Africa because Africa may accept the CE standards or the European Union standards. So a manufacturer chooses European standards, have it tested, and then exports it into Africa because the requirements are the same. But the new directive states that you should not put a CE mark unless it's capable of operating in at least one of the European member states. Manufacturers shall ensure that procedures are in place for series production to remain in conformity with this directive. Changes in radio equipment design or characteristics and changes in the harmonized standards or in other technical specifications by reference to which conformity of radio equipment is declared shall be adequately taken into account. So, for example, for 2.4 gigahertz devices, there's a new version of the EN300/328 standard this year that took effect, which had major revisions to it from the previous one, and manufacturers needed to update their declaration of conformity to reference the newer version of the standard. So the declaration of conformity is a living, breathing document that needs to be revised as appropriate when standards change or directives change. I've listed the EN300/328 version 181, but there's a 182 that's been uploaded to the official journal. Okay, additional manufacturer obligations. Radio devices need to bear a type, batch, or serial number or other element allowing its identification. If the device is too small, this information can go on the packaging or user manual. A lot of times I've seen the serial number being on the label, and sometimes I've seen a batch number. So any one of those two is sufficient to meet that requirement. The device also needs to show the manufacturer name, registered trade name or registered trademark, and the postal address at which they can be contacted. If the device is too small, this information can go on the packaging or user manual. Manufacturers shall ensure that the radio equipment is accompanied by instructions and safety information in a language which can be easily understood by consumers and other end users, as determined by the member state concerned. At a minimum, the following information shall be provided: frequency bands in which the radio equipment operates, maximum radio frequency power transmitted in the frequency bands in which the radio equipment operates. Manufacturers shall ensure that each item of radio equipment is accompanied by a copy of the EU Declaration of Conformity or by a simplified EU Declaration of Conformity. Where a simplified EU Declaration of Conformity is provided, it shall contain the exact Internet address where the full text of the EU Declaration of Conformity can be obtained. So if you have a DOC several pages long, rather than having it with the product, you can have what's known as a simplified version, where you can point to the URL of where a customer can find the full DOC. Manufacturers who consider or have a reason to believe that radio equipment which they have placed on the market is not in conformity with this directive shall immediately take the corrective measures necessary to bring the radio equipment in conformity, to withdraw it or recall it if appropriate. So for the CE marking shall be affixed visibly, legibly, and indelibly to the radio equipment or to its data plate, unless that is not possible or not warranted on account of the nature of the radio equipment. The CE marking shall also be affixed visibly and legibly to the packaging. The CE marking shall be affixed before the radio equipment is placed on the market. On account of the nature of the radio equipment, the height of the CE marking affixed to the radio equipment may be lower than 5 millimeters, provided that it remains visible and legitimate. The CE marking shall be followed by the identification number of the notified body where the conformity assessment procedure set out in Annex IV is applied. So if you do get a notified body opinion, or as under the Radio Equipment Directive, it's called the Type Examination Certificate, you would need to place the number of the notified body next to the CE mark. And I showed you two ways of doing it wrong. For one thing, the notified body number needs to be after the CE mark and not underneath it. And they both need to be the same height. So the CE mark and the notified body number should be the same height. Okay, so we're going to talk about a little bit about conformity assessment procedures. Annex II, which is also referred to as Module A, is the internal production control. Annex III is Modules B and C, and this is the EU type examination and conformity to type based on internal production control. Annex IV, also referred to as Module H, is conformity based on full quality assurance. And next couple of slides will go into each one of these. Annex II, Module A, is the internal production control. It's the conformity assessment procedure whereby the manufacturer fulfills the obligations laid down in points 2, 3, and 4 noted below of this annex and ensures and declares on his sole responsibility that the radio equipment concerned satisfies the essential requirements set out in Article 3. So if you're a manufacturer, you've used all harmonized standards, you can proceed to follow Annex II. And as long as you have the technical documentation to back up that you meet all the requirements, you manufacture according to good practices, and you place the CE mark on the label on the product, and draw up a EU Declaration Conformity, you should be all good to go. And this is all defined in Annex II. So Annex III, which is Modules B and C, there's two modules under this annex. So Module B is the EU type examination, which is equivalent to the notified body opinion that you would get under the R&TTE Directive. So the EU type examination is a part of a conformity assessment procedure in which a notified body examines the technical design of the radio equipment and verifies and attests that the technical design of the radio equipment meets the essential requirement set out in Article 3. So if you had a Wi-Fi access point, you'll do all the testing according to the standards that are applicable to your device. You'll send the test reports and all other documentation to a notified body, and they'll review your work, and they'll issue a opinion or a EU type examination certificate to go along with that opinion. And then under Annex III, Module C is the internal production control. It is the conformity to type based on internal production control. It's a part of a conformity assessment procedure whereby the manufacturer fulfills the obligations laid down in points 2 and 3 as below, and ensures and declares that the radio equipment concerned is in conformity with the type described in the EU type examination certificate and satisfies the requirements of this directive that apply to it. So you have to make sure that your manufacturing is done with good engineering practices, and you place the CE mark on the product, and you issue your declaration of conformity. So declaring compliance to the radio equipment directive under Annex III is a two-step process. The first step is where you do all of the testing and you submit all the documentation to a notified body. If the opinion is positive, they will issue you a type examination certificate stating that it complies with the radio equipment directive. Step 2 is whereby you make sure that during your manufacturing processes you follow all the steps that make sure that the device that was reviewed by the notified body is actually being produced and nothing will change throughout their manufacturing process. So you guarantee that through your manufacturing controls and processes. And after those two steps are complete, that is when you place the label on your product and draw up a declaration of conformity. So Annex IV, which is conformity based on full quality assurance. Conformity based on full quality assurance is the conformity assessment procedure whereby the manufacturer fulfills the obligations laid down below and ensures and declares on his sole responsibility that the radio equipment concerned satisfies the requirements of this directive that apply to it. So it's a multi-step process. First is manufacturing. The manufacturer shall operate an approved quality system for design, manufacture, final radio equipment inspection, and testing of the radio equipment concerned as specified in point 3 and shall be subject to surveillance. The second step is the quality system. The manufacturer shall lodge an application for assessment of his quality system with the notified body of his choice for the radio equipment concerned, and then surveillance under responsibility of a notified body. The purpose of surveillance is to make sure that the manufacturer duly fulfills the obligations arising out of the approved quality system. So with Annex IV is a three-step process. First, the manufacturer makes sure that manufacturing happens to an approved quality system. The second and third parts involve a notified body. The notified body make sure that the quality system, that the manufacturer does follow the quality system as they have laid it out, and also does surveillance on a regular interval to make sure that those processes are being followed. So the regularity of the surveillance could be 6 months, it could be a year, but that's something that needs to be worked out with the notified body. So the notified body does get involved with the audit process for that manufacturing process. And then after all that's complete, then that's when you put the CE mark on your product and issue the declaration of conformity. So the manufacturer shall affix the CE marking in accordance with Articles 19 and 20 and under the responsibility of the notified body referred to in point 3.1, the latter's identification number to each item of radio equipment that satisfies the applicable requirements. So as you can see, the only time you would use a notified body is if you were following Annexes 3 and 4, and the only time you'd put a notified body number is if you were following Annex 4. So we're going to take go through a little bit of a simple example just to drive home some of the ideas. Let's say you are a manufacturer that wants to sell a 2.4 gigahertz access point into Europe. The first thing that as a manufacturer you would want to do is come up with a game plan on what standards you should test your device against to make sure it meets all the essential requirements. So remember, under essential requirements, you need to make sure it's safe for the general public, and also that it uses the spectrum efficiently. So I've listed EN 60950, which is a safety standard which can be used for a particular radio device to make sure it meets the safety requirements pointed out in 3.18. Then 301.489 and its sister standards can be used to fulfill the requirements of 3.1b, which is the EMC, the requirements. And then 300.328 can be used to verify that the device uses the spectrum efficiently. And I did get a question on the version of the 328. 181 was released this year, and I believe there's a 191 that's out. That's because under 181 there were some timing issues with frequency hopping devices where it was almost impossible to meet those requirements, and 191 was released to address those issues. And then after you've gone through all the testing and you have the test reports in hand, decide which conformity assessment to use. Is it Annex II, where you don't do anything as far as the notified body is concerned because you've used all harmonized standards, and then you just use Annex II and you put the CE label and you issue a declaration of conformity saying it meets the scope of the Radio Equipment Directive under your sole responsibility. Or you can choose to use a notified body under Annex III or IV. Then keep a record of all technical documentation and all relevant data or details of the means used by the manufacturer to ensure that radio equipment complies with the essential requirements. The technical documentation shall be drawn up before the product is placed on the market and shall be continuously updated. So as I mentioned before, the Declaration of Conformity and all the other relevant documents should be living, breathing documents where it needs to be updated when it's needed to, as called out. For instance, if a standard changed or a directive changed. Manufacturers shall take all measures necessary so that the manufacturing process and its monitoring ensure compliance of the manufactured radio equipment with the technical documentation referred to above and with the relevant essential requirements set out in Article 3. Place the CE mark and draw up the DOC in the official language of the member state that you plan on selling. The label should also contain a serial or batch number and other manufacturer identifying information, such as postal address. This may also go in the user manual if the device is so small. And verify that 2.4 gigahertz is allowed in the member state that you plan on selling, which is most important. I'm going to discuss a little bit about surveillance. It's a hot topic, not just in Europe, but other economies as well. More and more devices are non-compliant based on surveillance audits that different entities have done. So if during a market surveillance there's a concern about device meeting essential requirements, the manufacturer will be asked to test the device by a body acceptable to the market surveillance authority at the expense of the manufacturer. So let's say you have a product in Europe and the market surveillance authorities go and pick up your product, and if they find something that's missing, maybe a CE label is not on your product, or it's operating on a frequency band that it's not supposed to, and they will contact the manufacturer, and not only will they have you test at a test lab of their choosing, but also you'll be asked to pick up the tab. And that's why they want all the information on the product, so that if such a thing does arise, they want to be able to contact the responsible party. And the responsible party is the manufacturer. I have some useful links here, and I verified this morning that they still work. One is a link to the directive itself. It's pretty lengthy. It's a good bedtime reading. The other one is the 2014 Blue Guide, which is basically a handbook that details the requirements of the radio equipment directive in a nice and easy way for you to understand. And the third link is the EU official journal, which lists all the standards that have been harmonized under the radio equipment directive, keeping in mind that once the radio equipment directive does come into effect, there will probably be another site where you can download or have access to the new standards under the radio equipment directive. So this last link is for the R&TTE Directive harmonized standards. Okay, that was the end of my presentation. We are going to go over to some questions, and give me a minute to read over these questions, and I'll go through them. Try to go through them one by one and try to answer the questions as best as I can. If there's something or questions we couldn't get to, we'll take them offline. Okay, so one question I got is, how small can the CE mark be? That's a good question. The requirement is the CE mark should be at least 5 millimeters high. But if the product is so small that 5 millimeters cannot be entertained, then it is justifiable to use a smaller print. But you don't want to, there's a fine line between a smaller print and something that cannot be read with the naked eye. I have another question. Can manufacturers get a notified body opinion or issue a DOC to the red today? So you cannot get an EU type certificate or a opinion under the radio equipment directive as of today. You would need to wait until the radio equipment directive takes effect. I have another one where, does a manufacturer require an authorized representative in the EU? And the question is no. So I have another question here, which says, how different is e-labeling with the actual labeling under the radio equipment directive? It's actually similar. So everything that we talked about here, if you wanted to use e-labeling, you would need to show all of the requirements under the e-labeling, meaning that you would need to show the CE mark, a notified body number as well as any other text that we talked about. I have another question. Does the RED create a registration system for all radio products, like the FCC for the US? That is a good question. There was some talk of in the past of doing this, but it did not work its way into the scope. So there's no current plans to have a list of all certified products yet. Doesn't mean it'll happen it won't happen in the future, but right now there is no such requirement. Okay, I have another question here. If I already have a product in a member state and I plan on keep selling after June 13th, 2017, what do I need to do? I think we discussed this a little bit during the presentation, but the first thing you would want to make sure is still is do you meet the requirements of the Radio Equipment Directive? Do you meet the latest versions of the standards? And if you do, you need to reissue your Declaration of Conformity document referencing the Radio Equipment Directive. I have another question here. If I am introducing a product right now to the European Union, which directive do I need to use? So right now you would need to use the R&TTE Directive. Next question is, who signs a Declaration of Conformity? The Declaration of Conformity is signed by the manufacturer. So next question is, where does the requirement to have the notified body number the same size as the CE mark come from? Is this just under the R&D? Is it just under the Radio Equipment Directive, or is it a more general requirement? So it's under the Radio Equipment Directive. It explicitly states that the notified body number and the CE mark shall be the same height. And I believe, if I'm not wrong, it was also under the R&TTE Directive as well. So I don't think that's changed. It's always been there. Okay, there's a couple of questions regarding EN 300-328. As I mentioned, 181 was released beginning of this year, and there has been a revision to it to account for the timing requirements for frequency hopping devices. And I forget if it's 182 or 191, but one of those is to address the timing requirements. I'm not sure if there's been another update since then. I haven't checked it lately, but that's as far as I know for the 300-328. But 300-328 version 181 still is valid. It hasn't expired yet, so there's no reason to panic. I believe that 181 will be in effect for a couple more months until it expires. Next question is, once the product is certified, does the product need to be recertified for any possible changes, updates in the directive? Yes, and it's true for changes in the directive as well as changes in standards. So changes in standards are more prevalent than changes in the directive. Changes in directive happens maybe once in a decade or so, whereas changes in standards might happen every 6 months. Next question, I guess the last one we have time for, is if we're selling in all of Europe, how many languages does our DOC need to be translated into? So it should be in each language that you want to sell to. So most of the countries, some of the countries, the official language is English. So with the English DOC, you might be able to get away with most of the countries. But where there are other countries where the official language is not English, then you would have to draw up a different DOC for each of those. It is cumbersome, but I can understand the rationale behind that, because market surveillance authorities and other entities will want to review those documentation when it gets imported into those countries.
So that concludes our webinar today. If you have any additional unanswered questions, please contact us via phone or email. Tomorrow, we will be sending a follow-up email that will include a link to the presentation. And that concludes our webinar. Thank you for joining us today.